All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on something that's like over 2,000 years old, but philosophers are still arguing about it today, the square of opposition.
Yeah, it's really wild how it takes these super simple logical statements, like all cats are mammals, and then bam, all these relationships of complexities pop out.
Exactly, and we've got some awesome material from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help us unpack this. I'm really excited to see where this goes. So before we get too deep in the weeds, can you give me like the elevator pitch? What is the square of opposition?
It's kind of like a map, but for logic. So you start with these four basic propositions, each with a letter, A, E, I, O, and each one covers a different way we can talk about categories.
Okay, so like a secret code for logic. What do the letters stand for? Can you give me some examples?
Sure, so A is like the all-encompassing statement, all SSP, like all dogs are mammals, that classic.
Got it. So A is for when you're making these big universal statements. What about E?
E is the opposite, the universal negative. So it's like no SSP, think no dogs are reptiles.
Makes sense. So E is like drawing a hard line, saying no way these things don't mix. I'm guessing I and O are for when it gets a bit more nuanced.
Exactly, you're getting it. I is the particular affirmative, so some SSP, like some dogs are brown.
And I bet O is the particular negative. Some dogs are not brown.
Nailed it, you're a natural. So the square of opposition basically shows us how these four statements, A, E, I, and O, are all connected. They can be contradictory, contrary, subcontrary, or even subaltern.
Whoa. Okay, now I definitely need some help breaking all that down. You start with contradictories. How can you tell if two statements are contradictory?
Contradictories are like total opposites. If one is true, the other has to be false. For example, all dogs are mammals and some dogs are not mammals or contradictory. They just can't both be true at the same time.
Makes sense. Like saying up and down and can't go both ways at once. All right, how about contraries? What are those?
Contraries are a little trickier. It's not that one has to be true if the other is false. It's more like they can't both be true, but they could both be false. Like think about all dogs are brown and no dogs are brown. If there are some brown dogs and some not brown dogs, then both of those statements are wrong.
Ah, so with contraries, there's some wiggle room? Like maybe neither statement really nails it? Okay, now I'm really curious about subcontraries. Where do they fit in?
Subcontraries are basically the opposite of contraries. So they can both be true, but they can't both be false. Like if you say some dogs are brown and some dogs are not brown, those can both be true at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. You could totally have a bunch of dogs where some are brown and some aren't. Last but not least, we've got these subalterns. What's the deal with those?
Subalterns are kind of like a hierarchy. So if the A statement, the universal affirmative, is true, then the I statement, the particular affirmative, automatically has to be true too. Same deal with E and O.
So, like, if all dogs are mammals, then logically, some dogs must also be mammals.
You got it. So far, so good, right? But here's where it gets interesting and maybe a little bit messy. The square of opposition, it starts to fall apart when we run into what we call empty terms.
Empty terms. All right, now you've really got my attention. What are those exactly?
Empty terms are words that refer to things that don't really exist. Like, imagine mythical creatures like unicorns or chimeras, those kinds of things.
So we're talking about stuff that's just in our imagination, and that's where the square of opposition starts to get a little wonky. This is getting good.
Exactly. And this is where philosophers have been arguing for forever. So imagine this statement. Some chimeras are fire-breathing. According to the traditional square, that I statement would be false, right? Because chimeras don't exist.
Yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. You can't have some of something that isn't even there.
Right. But then if that's false, it's contradictory. The E statement, no chimeras are fire-breathing, should be true, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of contradictories. If one is false, the other has to be true.
Exactly. But here's the problem. If no chimeras are firing is true, then it's subaltern. Some chimeras are not fire-breathing should also be true. But wait, how can that be true? There aren't any chimeras in the first place. It's like, how can they be fire-breathing or not fire-breathing if they don't even exist? The whole system seems to break down.
So the square of opposition, it like crashes and burns when we start talking about fictional creatures? Is that the end of the story?
Not quite. It turns out there's a twist. We have to go back to the source, to Aristotle himself, to see where things went off track.
So you're saying Aristotle, he like figured out how to make the square of opposition work, even with these empty terms. Like he had some kind of workaround.
It wasn't really a workaround, but he did phrase the O proposition a bit differently. Instead of saying some S is not P, Aristotle used not every S is P.
Huh. Yeah, that's subtle. Does that really change things that much?
Oh, it's huge. It changes everything. Think about our chimera example again. Let's try it with not every chimera is fire-breathing. Now that statement, it can actually be true even if chimeras don't exist.
Wait, I think I see what you mean. It's not saying there are definitely chimeras out there that aren't fire-breathing, right? It's more like, it's just saying it's not true that every single chimera would be breathing fire, if they were real.
Exactly. And that difference, it's really important. It gets at a key assumption in Aristotle's logic. Affirmative statements, the A and I ones, they have what we call existential import.
Existential import. Okay, now we're getting fancy. What does that mean in plain English?
Basically, it means that when you say an A or I statement, you're assuming the things you talk about, they actually exist in the world. Like if you say all cats are mammals, yeah, assuming there are cats out there somewhere. But negative statements, like E and Aristotle's version of O, they don't have that requirement.
Okay, so like, not every unicorn is purple. That doesn't need unicorns to actually exist for it to make sense. That's pretty clever. So Aristotle's way of saying it kind of sidesteps the whole empty terms problem. Case closed, right?
Well, hold on a second. Aristotle, he had it figured out, yeah. But then these later philosophers came along and, well, they kind of stirred things up again.
Oh no, what did they do? This is where I have a feeling it gets even more complicated.
You're telling me these later philosophers, especially in the medieval period, they actually changed the wording of that O proposition back to the sum S is not P version. And you know what? They brought back the very same problem that Aristotle had avoided so nicely.
Wait, why would they do that? You'd think they'd see the issue with empty terms.
It seems like they were really focused on other parts of logic and maybe didn't fully realize what they were doing to the square. They got really into these principles, contraposition and adversion, which, don't get me wrong, they're interesting ideas, but they cause a whole bunch of new problems with those empty terms.
Okay, I'm up for exploring these new twists and turns, but can we back up a sec? What exactly are contraposition and obversion?
So let's say you have the statement, all philosophers love logic, right? Contraposition basically lets you swap the subject and the predicate and then negate both of them. So you end up with all non-lovers of logic are non-philosophers.
So you're basically flipping the sentence around and then sticking non onto both parts. I think I can follow that. What about obversion? How does that work?
Obversion lets you switch between positive and negative statements. You keep the basic structure but negate the predicate term. So all philosophers love logic becomes no philosopher is a non-lover of logic.
All right, so you're playing around with the wording to make the statement positive or negative. Seems pretty straightforward. But you said these principles, they cause trouble when you throw in empty terms. Can you give me like a concrete example?
Sure, let's take one of Buridan's examples. Buridan, he was a 14th century philosopher who really wrestled with this stuff. He pointed out that contraposition can lead you from a true statement to a false one when you're dealing with empty terms. So, for example, a chimera is not a man. That's obviously true, right? Chimeras, they're not real.
Yeah, definitely true. No argument there.
But watch what happens when you apply contraposition. We get a non-man is not a non-chimera. And because non-man includes basically everything that isn't human, this is saying there are things that aren't non-chimeras, which means there are chimeras.
But that doesn't make sense. It's the opposite of what we started with.
Exactly. And that shows how contraposition, even though it seems logical at first, it just breaks down when you have empty terms.
So it sounds like by going back to that O phrasing and then throwing in these new principles, the medieval philosophers, they kind of made things worse.
Well, it's not really about making things worse. It's more like their work really brought to light how tricky the square of opposition can be, especially with these empty terms. In fact, by the 14th century, some philosophers were tackling this problem head on.
Really? So they were actively trying to find solutions. What did they come up with? So they were like on a mission to figure out how to make this square work, even with these empty terms. What kind of ideas did they come up with?
Well, there was this philosopher, Paul of Venice, and he had some interesting examples trying to show how those O propositions, and they could still be true, even with empty subjects. Like he said, some man who is a donkey is not a donkey is actually true.
Wait, what? That sounds like a total contradiction. How can that be true?
It does sound weird, right? But remember what we were saying about existential import? Those O propositions, they don't actually need the subject to exist. So in this case, what it's really saying is that there's this creature, right? It's both a man and a donkey, but also not a donkey. And since that kind of creature it just can't exist, the statement ends up being true. True because it's talking about an empty category.
Ah, okay, I think I'm getting it. It's true because it's referring to something that's impossible. That's pretty clever. So those medieval logicians, they were really starting to understand these empty terms. Did that solve everything?
Well, not quite. Empty terms, they still cause problems, especially for Aristotle's scientific theories.
Right, Aristotle, he was all about those universal claims, like all humans are animals. But if there was a time when humans didn't exist yet, wouldn't that make his statements false?
That's the problem. If there was ever a time with no humans, then the square of opposition, it says that some humans are not animals, would have to be true. And that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it goes against the whole idea that humans are animals. How did they get around that one?
Different philosophers, they had different ideas, but one of them, John Buridan, he had this really interesting solution. He said that when we talk about scientific stuff, we're not just talking about what exists right now. We're talking about every possible case of a thing, past, present, future, you name it.
So when Aristotle says all humans are animals, he's not just talking about us. He's talking about every human who's ever lived, will ever live, and even could exist.
Exactly. So by making the statement about all possible humans, Buridan avoids that dirty term problem. All humans are animals. It's always true because there's always at least some human, even if it's just a possible one.
That's pretty smart. Those medieval philosophers, they really knew their logic. But what about more modern philosophers? Have they weighed in on this whole square of opposition thing?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There have been tons of attempts to make the traditional square work with on modern logic. One of the most famous is from Peter Strawson, of a 20th century philosopher.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did Strawson have to say?
Strawson's big idea, it was to redefine what truth even means when we're talking about empty terms. He said that statements with empty terms, they don't have a truth value at all. They're not true or false.
So like some chimeras are fire-breathing. It wouldn't be true or false. It would just be kind of floating out there in this logical limbo.
Exactly. And he also redefined entailment. So instead of being about truth values, it became about whether a statement is actually true. So in his system, one statement entails another only if there's no way the first one can be true and the second one false.
So did Strawson manage to save the square of opposition with all this?
Well, he was able to keep some of the traditional relationships, yeah. Like he could still show that all SSP entails some SSP.
But I feel like there's a but coming.
There is. Strawson's system, it works for some things, but there's a trade-off. It allows for these chains of reasoning where you can start with something true and end up with something false.
Oh, that doesn't sound good. Got an example?
Remember our chimera friend. So let's start with no chimeras are men, which is true. And following Strawson's rules, we can switch it around to get no men are chimeras. Then, if we do some obversion and subalternation, we end up with some non-man is a chimera.
But that can't be right. Chimeras, they don't exist.
Exactly, and that's the catch with Strawson's system. It might keep some parts of the square of opposition, but it loses that key idea of logic, giving us a system where we can reason correctly.
So after all this back and forth, all these debates over centuries, is the square of opposition a useful tool or is it a dead end?
That's the million-dollar question. Philosophers are still arguing about it today. I mean, it's definitely not perfect, especially when you think about all the weird things language can do and how some words refer to things that don't even exist. But the theory of opposition, it has been super valuable for understanding how different logical statements fit together.
It's wild how this one seemingly simple idea has sparked so much debate for so long.
It just goes to show how powerful philosophy can be. By questioning and analyzing and trying to make sense of even these basic ideas like some and all, we learn so much about language, logic, and even the nature of reality itself.
That's a great point. It makes me wonder if even something as fundamental as the square of opposition can be challenged and changed, what other hidden stuff might be lurking in our everyday thinking? I feel like there's always more to discover.
Absolutely, and that's what makes philosophy so exciting. It's a never-ending journey of exploration. So keep questioning, keep exploring, keep pushing the boundaries of what you think you know. You never know what you might find.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the square of opposition. It's been a wild ride. And to all our listeners, keep those minds sharp and keep those questions coming. Until next time.